Last part of chapter 52 here, we're going to be looking at behavior and habitat selection. We had spoke previously about actual range versus potential range, and we started to realize, without actually having it in words, that some organisms do not inhabit their potential range. We saw that with the cattle egret. It had an actual range in Africa, but its potential range, as it turns out, was much, much larger than that, and it expanded a little bit. So not all organisms, most organisms, in fact, don't inhabit their full potential range. So what prevents that? Well, we could have geographic isolation as one, and that's the case with many, but could behavior play a role in restricting the range? Well, it's not entirely understood, but it has been observed in insects. Keep in mind, in lab settings, we use insects very commonly, like those fruit flies, because they're easy to control, they reproduce quickly, and we can get results pretty quickly. So what scientists have noticed in insects is that many will lay eggs as a result of a very, very select stimuli from the environment. And with that stimuli, a female will lay eggs. As a result, when those eggs hatch, those insects are stuck in that one particular spot. So, does behavior limit distribution or range? Well, in the case of insects, yes. Could that possibly apply to other organisms? Well, quite possibly. We're not quite sure, though. But at least in insects, at least in that lab setting, we have seen that it does. So what else impacts range, distribution? Well, biotic factors. We looked a lot about abiotic factors, but biotic factors do as well. In the case that we see here going on our screen, we're looking at seaweed here, which would be indicated by each of these lines that we see. So we have red, blue, green, and purple. And seaweed is obviously a plant, and herbivores, such as limpets and sea urchins, feed upon those. So scientists grew seaweeds with sea urchins and limpets present to see how that would affect the growth of that seaweed. And what they found is when they had both sea urchins and limpets present, both herbivores, there was very, very little seaweed that grew. Then they kept in the sea urchins, but they removed the limpets. Once again, almost no seaweed grew. Then they kept in the limpets, and they removed the sea urchins. So they got rid of these things. And seaweed grew pretty substantially, actually, relative to these two. And then they removed both the limpets and the sea urchins from the environment, and seaweed grew even better. So what can we say? Well, seaweed grows better in the absence of these herbivores. These are biotic factors. Do these biotic factors influence the amount of population or the size of a population of a plant such as seaweed? And in fact, yes, it does. So we got biotic factors and how they affect the distribution of seaweed. Could this apply to other living things? Absolutely. If you have something that feeds upon you and that's removed, what's going to happen to your population size? Probably grow a little bit more than others, provided that there's enough resources for the population to be sustained. So continuing on with that, some other biotic factors that impact distribution, population growth. Pollinators. Plants rely heavily on bees or pollinators to disperse their gametes. And if they are present, their populations will probably increase, and if bees are absent, those plants will probably decrease in population size. There's also food resources, parasites, pathogens, and competing organisms like these two kangaroos here duking it out. Those certainly influence population size. And then lastly, abiotic factors that influence distribution. We got temperature, water and oxygen, salinity, sunlight, rocks and soil. Temperature might not seem like a big deal, but even a slight change in temperature can prove fatal for certain species. Not all species are as tolerant as humans are to a wide fluctuation of temperature. They need a select set temperature in order to survive. So temperature does limit distribution of some organisms. Water and oxygen, especially in dry areas and aquatic environments. Think about deserts, limited water. So not a lot of things can survive here. Only select things can. Similarly with aquatic environments where there's a lot of water, how much oxygen is present. Salinity, pH in soil, so to speak. Not pH, but salt in soil. If soil happens to be salty, slugs, an important heterotroph in soil, will be affected, because if you've ever poured salt on a slug, it shrivels up and dies. So there cannot be high levels of salt in the soil, or if there are, it can affect life. Sunlight. Some plants need a lot of sunlight. Some plants need very little sunlight. And if you think about some of the plants you might have in your home. In your home, is there a lot of sunlight? Well, maybe there's some, but not a lot of direct sunlight like maybe in your front yard. Some plants don't need as much sunlight as others. So the amount of sunlight, well, that dictates what plants can survive, and what plants happen to be available will dictate what type of herbivores and ultimately food chains can also be in that same area. And lastly, rocks and soil. This is where we're talking about pH. We talked about pH and how that affects plants previously with the color of the flowers, but some plants require higher or lower levels of pH. Pine trees happen to produce those pine needles which fall to the ground and ultimately create quite acidic soils, which kind of gives pine trees the space that they need, because a lot of other things can't grow in the acidic soils. So that's kind of one way that pine trees kind of claim the ground as their own, is by putting off acidity, which prevents other competing trees from replacing them. So that's how abiotic factors affect distribution of organisms, and this does conclude Chapter 52. Take a look at those chapter and section review questions if you'd like.